Number 10. Stubbins Firth. When the yellow fever epidemic broke out in Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania was conscripted to help find a cure. One of their many prestigious doctors was a man by the name of Stubbins Firth, and this man had a mission. He was determined to understand the root cause of the disease, and nothing would stop him from ensuring that this evil was defeated. Firth theorized that yellow fever was not a contagious disease, but instead related to the heat of the summer. To prove this, Firth decided that he would perform an experiment with himself as the subject. Firth then smeared himself in the bodily waste of patients infected with yellow fever, rubbing it into cuts on his arms, pouring it in his eyes, frying it and inhaling the fumes, and when that all didn't work, he just ate it. And well, he didn't catch the disease. However, it didn't actually end up proving anything about the disease, as the samples had come from already recovered patients. Years later, after his death, Cuban scientist Carlos Finlay would then correctly attribute the root of the disease to mosquitoes. Number 9. Paracelsus, a deeply important figure to the world of medicine. Paracelsus was a Swiss doctor, philosopher, and just general weirdo. One of the key figures during the German Renaissance, he's known as the father of toxicology and a practitioner of hermeticism, wandering around the world before eventually taking up residency in Germany and teaching from the University of Basel. He was reportedly quite unstable, frequently under the influence of spirits, refusing to accept conventional medicine, and outright burning books he didn't like in protest, and just, generally being a little freak. He claimed, get ready for this one, that it was possible to grow a man by fermenting sperm inside of a jar of horse dung, an experiment which he carried an example of with wherever he went. Number 8. Jose Delgado. Alright, everyone else on this list is pretty evil. The last two were just, kind of funny. Jose Delgado was a Spanish doctor who worked out of Yale University. His research, on the other hand, was deeply disturbing. The neurologist's primary interest focused around the stimulation of responses in the brain using electricity, which he hoped to be able to use to force the brain to produce the thoughts and emotions that he wanted. In other words, actual mind control. And if that isn't terrifying enough, he also ran experiments on anyone he could find, which usually ended up being people who were either schizophrenic or epileptic. One of his more famous experiments was the one where he used a remote control device to make a bull stop its charge. Number 7. Robert Liston. Liston is an infamous surgeon who worked in the Victorian era. He quickly earned a reputation for being the fastest knife in the West End, and being able to amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. That did happen, by the way, and the patient died of gangrene. He also amputated one of his assistant's fingers for some reason, and they also died of gangrene. Oh, and then, for some inexplicable reason, he lashed out at a surgical spectator who died from shock. What? Either way, Liston was also known as the first surgeon to use anesthesia in Europe, so... Wait, no, what? Number 6. Giovanni Aldini. If you don't know this guy, you'll know who he inspired. An Italian physician, Aldini worked primarily in the application of galvanism to the medical profession, which was the study of passing electricity through the nervous system to induce movement. His most famous experiment was in how he stimulated movement in the body of an executed criminal in London, which was recorded by the Newgate Calendar. Quote, "On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye actually opened." The report goes on to describe how the legs and hands were moved as well. A fearful visage for any bystander. Number 5. Andrew Ure. But this inspiration didn't just stop with Aldini. Where the Italian walk, Ure sprinted. Working as a professor of natural philosophy, Ure would establish himself as a well-respected scientist, with a wide variety of focuses that he could claim mastery over. However, when Ure was approached by his friend and professor of anatomy, James Jeffrey, to aid in an experiment, Ure's writings on what happened next would catapult him into fame. Jeffrey had been working on a similar experiment to Aldini's, using using the body of a criminal as a test subject and stimulating movement through the phrenic nerve. In 1819, Ure would record an incident where Jeffrey would display his discovery to the public, first moving limbs, then stimulating the eyes to open, and finally causing the contortions of muscles in the face to create terrifying expressions. Members of the crowd reportedly sprinted from the room in horror, and one man was even recorded to have fainted. Number 4. Robert Nelson. One of the stranger entries on this list, Nelson's experiments could be argued as something between evil and just misguided. As it turns out, that division is pretty hard to define, as Bob Nelson's ultimate end goal was the ability to resurrect anyone. Starting as a TV repairman, Nelson would partner with an actual doctor by the name of Dante Brunel, and they would begin to develop a machine to preserve people in an early form of cryostasis. Putting out a call for subjects, they found themselves with an offer from James Bedford, a professor dying of kidney cancer which had metastatized into his lungs. As Bedford passed through legal death, Nelson and Brunel went about preserving his body with the hopes that he could be resurrected when the cure for cancer was discovered. Pumping his blood full of antifreeze, they stored the body in Alcor, the first of what would later number in the hundreds. Number 3. Robert G. Heath. This scumbag was a psychiatrist working out of Louisiana, with his primary study being deep brain stimulation, or DBS. Heath proposed that through DBS he was capable of influencing anyone to be able to change their mind, and thus he could cure mental illness through electrical stimulation. His claims were absurd, stating that he had successfully managed to give patients schizophrenia through blood transfusions and electrical shocks. As most of those patients died, it was fairly difficult to confirm this. He also claimed to find the cure for being gay. He claimed that he'd managed to quote-unquote cure a patient of being gay, since that was actually considered a mental illness at the time. It's also implied that he had an involvement with the project MKUltra, though this remains unconfirmed, but extremely plausible. Number 2. Ilya Ivanov. A Russian scientist, if you couldn't tell immediately, Ivanov was a particularly strange scientist. The majority of his experiments revolving around two things. The first was the perfection of the method in which artificial insemination was done, which allowed for easier access to the technology, which was primarily used by horse breeders. His second interest was weirder. Ivanov apparently was extremely interested in creating a human-ape hybrid. Fortunately, he only attempted to do this through artificial insemination. Ivanov failed to create a pregnancy, but his legacy lives on as one of the most odd experiments ever conceived. Like, just why? Number 1. Shiro Ishii. There's not much to say about this man, and at the same time, there is so much more that needs to be said. Ishii was the Surgeon General of Unit 731, the perpetrator of one of the most notorious and vile series of experiments the world has ever witnessed. Some of these included infecting subjects with the plague, using live subjects for weapons testing, forced pregnancies, vivisections on live and aware subjects, and the induction of frostbite on live subjects. When Japan surrendered, he attempted to destroy the files that would indict him, but failed. Didn't matter either way, as he was granted war crime immunity by the US government and later employed by them to advise on bioweapons. I'm not joking. This man is a monster, did monstrous things, and got away with it scot-free. The Japanese government has not taken responsibility for the actions of Unit 731.
Starting with number 10 now, we have David Reimer. When this Canadian man was born in 1965, he was sent to be circumcised, but the doctors experimented with an unconventional technique and ended up removing David's entire penis. Now, doctors told his parents the best solution would be to give him a sex change operation right there and then, raise him as a girl, and never let him know the truth. This ended up tearing his parents apart, and his dad told David the truth when he was 14. David then chose to get a reverse sex operation. It was a success. However, David struggled a lot with the events of his past and ended up committing suicide at just 38 years old. At number 9 now, we have the chimp baby. In the 1930s, a scientist called Winthrop Kellogg thought a chimp could grow up to be like a human if it lived alongside a human baby, his own son. For 9 months, he conducted experiments, and his son Donald was inseparable from the chimp called Goose. Gua. They ate together and they played together. They noticed that Gua was picking up more and more human tendencies from Donald than ever before, but the experiment came to an abrupt halt when Donald, the human baby, began to regress and become more like a chimp. Apparently, he would just sit there howling and wailing and would struggle to pick up even basic language like a normal human baby. The experiment was stopped immediately. Alright, at number 8 now, we have the monster study. This 1939 experiment was conducted on 22 orphans to see how children responded to positivity and negativity when it comes to speech therapy. Half the children were praised for their efforts, while the other half were teased and belittled for their speech imperfections. Many of the children who received this negative feedback went on to suffer serious psychological damage for the rest of their lives. It was so bad that some of them could barely even speak again. The monster study got its name from its shocking experimentation on orphan children just to prove a hypothesis. Alright guys, coming in at number 7 now, we have Tusko. This one was just messed up, if I'm honest. In 1962, when the CIA was absolutely obsessed with finding out the effects of LSD, they experimented on an elephant with the help of the University of Oklahoma. The elephant, called Tusko, weighed 3.5 tons and was given enough LSD to make 3,000 humans hallucinate. The CIA were trying to see if they could make the elephant enter must, which is a naturally occurring state where elephants become violent and uncontrollable. The experiment was a total disaster. Tusko almost immediately collapsed and had a seizure for almost 2 hours before finally dying. At number 6 now, we have the Stanford prison experiment. This psychology experiment conducted by Stanford University involved splitting 24 random students into 2 groups. One group were the prison guards and the others were their prisoners. This was set up for them to study how power and authority works within human groups, but it got really messed up. It was supposed to last 2 weeks, but had to be stopped after just 6 days because the guards began to abuse their power. They would emotionally and physically abuse the prisoners. After just the first day alone, the guards were already attacking them with fire extinguishers. Yeah. Some of them suffered serious mental and physical injuries for life. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the yellow fever experiment. Dr. Firth was a scientist who was trying to prove that yellow fever was not contagious and was actually due to the difference between summer and winter. Now, in an effort to prove this, he tried to infect himself with yellow fever by drinking the vomit of victims. He also injected it into his body and even poured it onto his eyes. Well, it turns out he was right about the whole seasonal thing, but for the wrong reason. It's mosquitoes that are the ones who spread yellow fever, and they hibernate in the winter. So all the vomit drinking and pouring in the eyes was for nothing. At the number 4 spot now, we have testicle radiation. In 1963, researchers offered prisoners in the Washington and Oregon area $25 to participate in reproductive radiation tests. Now, they were told they wanted to see how a normal dose of X-ray level radiation would affect a man's testicles. Instead, they hit them with about 6 times that amount of radiation. The prisoners, as you might expect, developed testicular cancer, they became sterile and had many other health problems. The class action lawsuit only gave $2,000 to each of the victims. We're at the number 3 spot now, and we have TGN-1412. This was the name of an experimental drug used to treat leukemia. As with most drugs for humans, it was first tested on animals to see if it was non-fatal. It wasn't. In fact, everything was fine with the animals. They moved on to testing the drug on humans, and just to be safe, they gave them a dose 500 times lower than the level found safe in animals. 6 of the test subjects were hospitalized with massive organ failure. The trial was stopped, and researchers started to work on why this drug was fine in the animals but almost killed 6 humans that it was given to. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the Guatemala syphilis experiment. This experiment involved US-backed Guatemalan doctors infecting soldiers, prisoners, and prostitutes in Guatemala with syphilis in order to study it. They wanted to see what the effectiveness of penicillin was on syphilis, except they only used penicillin on about half of the 1,308 people involved in the study. At least 83 people died, and 63 years later, President Barack Obama apologized on behalf of the US to the Guatemalan president. And finally, at number 1 now, we have MK Ultra. This CIA experiment was conducted in the 50s and the 60s in an effort to see if LSD and other drugs could mind control people. They tested the drug on countless unwitting citizens, some of them weren't even American. Many of them suffered life-altering mental conditions and became very unstable. Those that tried to speak out about what had happened met mysterious deaths, such as suspicious suicides. Not surprisingly, most of the documents involved with these shocking experiments were later destroyed. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Manhattan Project. Some of you guys may recognize the name of this one. It was the secret name for America's project to produce the atomic bombs that brought World War II to an end. Harry Daghlian was a young physicist who worked on the project. During an experiment on August 21st, 1945, he was attempting to build a neutron reflector manually by stacking a set of 4.4 kilogram tungsten carbide bricks in an incremental fashion around a plutonium core. Unfortunately, he dropped a brick which set off a chain reaction. He tried to stop the reaction, but by the time it was over, he received a high dose of neutron radiation. Harry received intense medical care for severe radiation poisoning. His mother and sister even flew out to New Mexico to care for him, but Harry fell into a coma. He died 25 days after the accident. His death resulted in new safety regulations when handling radioactive material. Next up at number 9 now, we have the dioxin tests. In 1965, dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman conducted a study on behalf of the US Army and some pharmaceutical companies. They wanted to know how human skin reacts to harsh chemicals, a process known as hardening. Most of the information about these tests has since been destroyed or just covered up. We do know that he described his patients as acres of skin to experiment on. We also know he used dioxin on them, the active ingredient in Agent Orange. This happened around the time the US was covering Vietnam with Agent Orange in an attempt to push the fight against the Viet Cong in their favour. To speed up the experiments, Dr. Kligman injected his victims with a reported 468 times the recommended safe dose of dioxin. After that, not much more has been uncovered. It's thought there are still about 70 of the patients out there still. Their identities and current condition unknown. Next up at number 8 now, we have Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the US Navy spent 6 days spreading the bacterium Surretia marcescens into the air about 2 miles off the coast of California. That bacterium lives in soil and water and is best known for its ability to produce a bright red pigment. This trait makes it useful in experiments because it's so bright, it's very easy to see where it is. The project was called Operation Sea Spray. Its aim was to determine the susceptibility of a big city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack by terrorists. In the following days, the military took samples of 43 sites to track the bacteria's spread. They found that it had infested the whole city and all the surrounding suburbs as well. During a test, residents of San Francisco inhaled millions of bacterial spores. The military deemed the experiment a success. They got to see how far chemical warfare could spread, and anyway, they knew the bacterium wasn't harmful, or so they thought. People started getting urinary tract infections, and it was even linked to the death of a patient recovering from prostate surgery. This experiment wasn't even public knowledge until 1976, a full 26 years after the event. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Project MK Ultra. This is a particularly famous one that you guys may have heard me talk about in a previous video. During the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the Cold War, the US feared that communist countries were using mind control techniques to brainwash US prisoners of war in Korea. They wanted in on the action. So in response, the CIA authorized Project MK Ultra in 1953. The secret operation was aimed at developing a defense against drugs or other manipulators that could control human behavior. Such was the secrecy of this project that even today, not much is known about it. But we do know this: the project involved more than 150 human experiments involving psychedelic drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy. Sometimes the test subjects were aware they were participating in a study, but shockingly, many did not, even when the hallucinogenic effects started kicking in. Can you even imagine how scary that would be? Many of the tests took place at universities, hospitals, or prisons in the US and Canada between 1953 and 1964. The CIA didn't keep many records though, and any good ones were destroyed when the program came to an official end in 1973. Moving on to number 6 now, we have North Korea. Some of the things we've all heard about North Korea may not be true, but some of them may be even worse than we could ever imagine. In 2014, a former North Korean officer stepped forward to say that the nation's military were using mentally and physically disabled children as test subjects in chemical experiments. He said this was the last straw that caused him to defect and leave the country. The man was called Im Cheon-young, and he said he was taken to special training at the military academy. It was there where they taught him how to confuse the enemy without revealing your own forces, how to carry out assassinations, and how to use chemical weapons. He was close to defecting on this alone, and then came the field learning. This involved involved testing biological and chemical weapons on so-called objects. At first, these objects were mice, but soon they were using humans. Im said that he saw with his very own eyes disabled people, sometimes children, being killed by these chemical weapons just to show the soldiers how they worked. One expert said this is not surprising. Anyone who visits the capital will never see disabled people because they are allegedly taken away as children and incarcerated in special camps. Perhaps these evil experiments are what the camps are all leading up to. Moving on to number 5 now, we have Project QKHILLTOP. This was a CIA project developed to study Chinese brainwashing techniques, which they used to develop new methods of interrogation. The research was led by a man named Dr. Harold Wolff. Now, he was a researcher at Cornell University's medical school. Dr. Wolff requested the CIA provide him with information on imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, hypnosis, and more. Based on this, the team began to formulate a plan. They wanted to develop secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures. According to a letter that he wrote, in order to fully test the effects of this, Wolff wanted the CIA to make available suitable subjects. Once they had provided these poor souls to test on, Wolff also detailed the next step his research team would take. They would then assemble, collate, analyze, and assimilate the information, and will then undertake experimental investigations designed to develop new techniques of offensive, defensive intelligence using a potentially useful secret drug. Basically, the whole thing is just the stuff of nightmares. I have no idea how this got through. Nothing more is really known about the test subjects, or victims as they are often referred to now. Moving up to number 4 now, we have Dr. Loretta Bender. This doctor has gone down in history for her experiments on children. She was a child psychiatrist who specialized in children believed to have schizophrenia. For almost 3 decades, from 1942 to 1969, she was a highly respected expert in her field. Her preferred choice of treatment was electroshock therapy. These days, the practice has been banned in most of the world as it's seen as ineffective, cruel, and borderline torture in some cases. Still, this was a different time, and that's what Dr. Bender did to the children. Her methods involved interviewing and analyzing a sensitive child in front of a large group of people. She would then apply a gentle amount of pressure to the child's head. The theory was any child who moved with the pressure was showing early signs of schizophrenia. These days, that's referred to as total pseudoscience, but it took a while to figure that out. By the time her treatments were shut down, Bender had used electroshock therapy on over 100 children, the youngest of whom was just age 3. Reports described her as uncaring and the study as unethical. The shocks can cause memory loss, nausea, headaches, jaw pain, or even serious heart trouble, even in kids. Some say all of this was a result of Bender's misunderstood childhood that she had, and she was the product of her own environment and family. Now that is proper psychology, I'm just saying. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Burke and Hare murders. William Burke is a guy who has probably tainted my surname forever. Along with William Hare, these 2 men from Northern Ireland were famous grave robbers in Scotland. One day, an old man they knew died, and to cover his outstanding debt to them, they decided to sell his body for medical science. Edinburgh University gave them £7 and 10 shillings, a handsome sum in those days. With that, they were hooked. When another associate they knew fell ill, they couldn't even wait to see if he would die, and so they suffocated him in his bed. Again, they sold his body to the university for money. The killing spree began. The pair murdered and sold bodies almost as their full-time jobs. They killed an old grandmother with an overdose of painkillers. Hare even killed his own blind grandson by breaking his back across his knee. Eventually though, their whole operation was discovered when they got too sloppy. William Burke was hanged in front of a cheering crowd of over 25,000 people. Fittingly, after being put on public display, his body was donated to medical science. Next up at number 2 now, we have J. Marion Sims. This doctor was once praised as the father of modern gynecology. Now his reputation has been tarnished forever. It was found that he practiced these surgical techniques that made him famous on enslaved women. They included Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. The rest of them are unknown. He performed 30 surgeries on Anarcha alone, all without anesthesia. His legacy has long been questioned for the disturbing ethical questions that it raises, especially by those who believe that he used black women as medical guinea pigs without their consent. The Black Youth Project 100, a group of activists aged between 18 and 35, staged protests at a statue of Sims in New York. They wore hospital gowns splashed with red paint dripping down their legs. In a Facebook post, they explained that Sims had purchased black women slaves and used them as guinea pigs for his untested surgical experiments. He repeatedly performed genital surgery on black women without without anesthesia because, according to him, black women don't feel pain. Despite his very inhumane tests on black women, Sims was named the father of modern gynecology, and his statue currently stands right outside the New York Academy of Medicine. And finally, number 1 now, we have the pregnant women. In January 2018, it emerged that after the Second World War, the US military gave nearly 1,000 pregnant women radioactive iron by their doctors without their knowledge. This was all part of a series of experiments to test the effects. Between 1945 and 1947, researchers at Vanderbilt University conducted this sick experiment that was funded by the US Public Health Service. All of the women were poor and had no knowledge of the experiment whatsoever. Afterwards, they were not even informed that they had been part of the study either. The radioactive iron was given as part of a medical cocktail by health officials that they trusted. Their aim was to record the absorption of iron during pregnancy. However, in the years since then, investigators have said this too was a lie, and that the real reason was for the military to learn more about radiation exposure. In the 1990s, Vanderbilt University finally acknowledged and investigated the experiments. The story broke when 2 women and one of their daughters filed a lawsuit against the university for exposing them to radiation. One of the women was Emma Kraft. She said at a Senate hearing that the experiments caused the death of her 11-year-old daughter due to cancer. The true effects of this study are still being investigated today. Alright, starting off at number 10 now, we have the twin studies. Joseph Mengele was the chief medical officer at Auschwitz concentration camp during the Holocaust. Far from being a doctor to the people there, he used them as part of his sort of twisted medical studies. Mengele had an obsession with twins. From 1943 to 1944, he performed experiments on almost 1,500 sets of imprisoned twins. Just 200 of them survived. One study involved injecting different dyes into the eyes of twins to see whether it would change their eye color. Another involved sewing twins together in some sort of sick attempt to create conjoined twins. Some of the other studies are far too graphic to even talk about in this video. Next up at number 9 now, we have the poison labs. This is the name given to the Soviet Union's secret testing labs for poisons. During the 1950s, the researchers there would test deadly poisons on prisoners who came from the gulags. That translates to enemies of the people. These poisons included mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, curare, cyanide, and many others. All of them are deadly to humans, and many of them are very painful. The goal of these studies was to find a tasteless, odorless chemical that could not be detected after death. In a final sick twist to this story, the prisoners were told that the poison was actually medicine for them. Insane. Next up at number 8 now, we have the Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo led a research team to study human behavior when it came to authority and inmates in a prison setting. He set up a mock prison and got 24 volunteers to take part in it. They were assigned as either prisoners or the guards watching over them. Everything was designed to look and feel like a real prison, from the uniforms to the cells and even the ID numbers. The guards started to get way more involved in their roles than the researchers thought they would, verbally and then physically abusing their prisoners. By just the second day, the prisoners had already started to rebel. The guards put it down with brutal violence against them. The prisoners began to get emotionally traumatized, and on the 6th day, the experiment was ended 8 days early. Moving on to number 7 now, we have the Aversion Project. This experiment was a medical torture program in South Africa conducted by Dr. Aubrey Levin during the 1970s and 1980s. It was the military's attempt to root out homosexuality from the army, as it was seen back then as a mental illness. Over the years, 900 gay servicemen and some women were sent to the infamous Ward 22 for sexual reassignment surgeries, some of them as young as 16 years old. These surgeries involved chemical castration and electric shock treatment. The surgery attempted to change the men into physical females. Apart from these surgeries being horrifically unethical, they were also botched quite often, leaving the victims cast out into the world without the hormones needed to maintain their new identities. Coming at number 6 now, we have Project 4.1. This was a US medical study of people living on the Marshall Islands who were exposed to radiation from a nearby nuclear bomb test in 1954. The study effectively saw them as guinea pigs in a radiation experiment. Many people accused the US government of having their primary goal as studying the people and not actually helping them. The poor residents of the Marshall Islands suffered miscarriages, stillbirths, developmental difficulties, and impaired growth. The government knew the American public would not react kindly to news of this experiment and ordered everyone involved to keep it a secret. But as you can tell, Secrets always get out. Next up at number 5 now, we have the monster study. With a name like that, you know it's not going to be good. This study took place at the University of Iowa in 1939 by Wendell Johnson. They took 22 orphan children and split them into 2 separate groups. One group was given positive speech therapy. That means they were praised and encouraged as they became more fluent in English. The other half got the exact opposite. They were belittled, even bullied every single time they made a mistake. This had a serious negative effect on the children. Some of them even stopped speaking altogether. Their mental health and academic studies suffered greatly. The university tried to sweep all of this under the rug, but eventually the details came out. They were criticized heavily for damaging vulnerable orphan children, maybe permanently, just to prove a theory. The university issued a public apology in 2001. At the number 4 spot now, we have the Willowbrook State School. This was a school in New York for people with mental disabilities. Starting from the late 1950s, medical researchers noticed there were large hepatitis outbreaks there. They studied it to gain a better understanding of the illness. However, the researchers seemed to cross a line when they began feeding live hepatitis viruses to 60 healthy children in order to study them. They watched their skin and eyes turn yellow, their livers got bigger, and they began to vomit and even refuse to eat. The researchers justified all of this by saying, well, they were going to get hepatitis anyway, but history has definitely condemned them. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Tusko experiment. This clinical study by the US Public Health Service took place for an astounding 40 years, beginning in 1932. It involved offering 399 poor black males who had syphilis a treatment. However, the researchers withheld the treatment as their real aim was to just study the progress of syphilis on humans. In 1947, penicillin became available as a treatment. Some of the victims began to look elsewhere for help, but the researchers told them not to and continued to lie about their true condition. When the study finally ended in 1972, just 74 of the 399 test subjects were still alive. 28 of them had died of syphilis, 100 from other complications. 40 of their wives had also been infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. As part of a class action lawsuit, the US government paid $9 million to the surviving participants and their descendants. For many people though, the pain can never be healed with money. Next up at number 2 now, we have mustard gas. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas in order to test the effectiveness of their new protective clothing for it. They wanted to see how it stood up in a real life situation and not just in a lab. Perhaps the most infamous of these experiments involved 17 and 18-year-old males still in boot camp who were asked if they wanted to take part in an experiment that would shorten the war. Of course, many of them said yes, but it wasn't until they reached a lab that they were told it would involve mustard gas. Some of them left at this point, but many of them didn't. Most of the participants suffered extreme external and internal burns. They were largely ignored by the Navy after that because they didn't want to draw attention to this awful experiment. And finally, at number 1 now, we have Unit 731. This was the secret chemical warfare research unit of Japan during World War II. They wanted to study the human body in perverse ways and mainly did so on Allied prisoners of war as well as Chinese civilians. Experiments included limb amputation to study the effects of blood loss, and sometimes they would even try and reattach amputated limbs to the other side of the body just to see what would happen. One other famous experiment there involved freezing all of the subject's limbs and then amputating them one by one until only the victim's head and torso remained. This is only really scratching the surface into the horrors that Unit 731 brought upon its many victims.